So when I stick to time, I've usually got someone in my ear. I mean, not literally, but a microphone going 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute. So I'm going to put the stopwatch on now. I'm going to talk to you about talking with artists. Artists often make work that generates stories or create stories. And artists often reflect on stories, but actually meeting artists generate a lot of stories too. And although I don't romanticize artists and designers and architects, and I don't think they're like species apart, I do think often they're people who interest me, people who have a different perspective, people whose view of the world and approach to the world I find inspiring. The first artist I ever met was this man, Anthony Caro, Sir Anthony Caro, OM to us. And I was a postgraduate student. I'd been to interview him about my thesis, which was about British sculpture in the 1960s. And he was really helpful, and I'd interviewed him for the thesis. And then I got a gig doing some freelance writing, and I wrote a review of a Caro exhibition that dealt with both architecture and sculpture, called Sculpitecture, but that moved away from his classic assembled sculpture off the pedestal onto the floor, literally in our space, abstract, unknowable from one angle, something you had to walk around in a way that if you see a sculpture of a human body, when it turns round, unless it has a fat ass, there's no real surprise. It's something you know from one angle. You can know the thing in its entirety through acquired knowledge. But he'd started to make work that emanated from this kind of table pieces that didn't just reflect on a relationship to painting, but actually had a direct relationship to painting. It was a literal transposition from two-dimensional imagery to three-dimensional form. So I wrote a review saying I thought he was one of the great sculptors, it was really inventive, but this was an arid intellectual exercise, an academic exercise, and not something he should pursue. And then I got a message from his studio saying, Tony would like to see you, would you come for tea? And I thought, this is amazing, this is what happens in British establishment creative life, that when you write a bad review, you're summoned to see the artist and he gives you a bollocking. So I thought, well, I'm up for this, off I went, slightly trepidatiously. I went into the studio, tea was served, and he said, I read your piece, it was on the table. I thought, it really is bad. And he said, I agreed with every word of it. And then we had a kind of conversation, and by the end of the conversation, I was arguing completely the opposite of that which I'd argued in the piece, and he was arguing from my perspective in the piece about the literalism of his work. Anyway, it began a creative conversation with an artist who I realised what he wanted from critics and what he wanted from people who came to his studio was critical engagement, critical dialogue. And often the artist's life is one of either gushing adoration when things are put in the public behind to their faces, and then some comments behind the back. But there is very little open conversation in the studio of the kind that he had with the great Clement Greenberg. Anyway, let's segue on. So I then started working with other artists when I became an artist at White Cube, but also through broadcasting. I started working with the great Gilbert and George, the ageing lords of misrule of the British art world, who insisted that when we were asked to pose together for a photograph, that I stood back and they pushed forward. And when they were invited to receive an honour at the Florence Biennale, this was the image they submitted because I had to give them the prize. They were always taking the piss. Then started, when I saw Anthony Caro later, they were very complimentary about him because he was one of their teachers. He was one of the artists who facilitated their approach to what they called living sculpture. They pronounced themselves to be the sculptural object, that what they did, their gestures made them living sculptures. And he sort of facilitated that at St Martin's School of Art. And when I saw him later, he said, I saw you were working with Gilbert and George now. He said to them, tell me, do you like their work? I said, I do. I really admire it. Why? I said, well, I think it's inventive. I think there's a kind of integrity to it. They've taken sculpture into different areas. They've never lost sight of what it is. And it's art with content. They believe that art has a purpose and that it deals with big questions of love, life, religion, sex, death, slightly parroting what Gilbert and George often said. And there was a pause. And Tony looked me in the eye and he went, good for you. And we never spoke about it again. Anyway, the Gilbert and George story I wanted to tell you, which they now tell quite regularly, which is brilliant. But I hadn't heard it. We used to do a series of conversations, and this was in an art school in Greece where they had a big show in Athens, and it was filled with art students on a Saturday morning, about 300 art students. And so I thought we better talk about some bigger themes because the minutiae of British cultural life, maybe not the reference points that these students would have. So I started talking about the urbanism of their practice and how they'd gone to art school in London, how they lived in the East End, and how everything seemed very urban. But they'd both grown up in rural communities. Did they ever think they would find inspiration in the rural? And they looked at me with horror, and they went into that kind of Gilbert and George patter, one finishing the other sentence, where they said, no, 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 we went to the country once. It turned out this was about 5 months before, quite recently. We went to see our friend Dan Farson. He lives in Somerset. We went on a train. We visited this charming village. The birds were singing. The sky was blue. The light was shimmering off the trees. We saw this charming couple sitting at the lich gate by this beautiful church. Good morning, we said. Fuck off, you weird-looking twats, came the reply. At which point, they said, we'll never go to the country again. It's deranged. Final trilogy of artists. And the link is working with content. An artist who believes that art not only has a content, but has to have purpose, an activist political purpose. And that's Ai Weiwei, who I started working for, or with rather, when I was at the Royal Academy. And we made a show together, and it took a year, only a year to make. There were particular reasons why this was the case. So I went to visit Weiwei in his studio in Beijing for the first time. And every lamppost opposite the studio, he's hung a Chinese lantern to draw attention to the surveillance camera on each of those lampposts. Him acknowledging that he knows he's being looked at. And a bicycle outside the studio with flowers on every day, changed, put on his Instagram account until his passport was given back, which at the time, this was back in 2014, he wasn't able to travel. He'd been released from prison 2 years before. This is the door, this is the sign. Ironic, he was charged with tax evasion. He wasn't charged, sorry, he was accused of tax evasion. Never charged because he wasn't evading taxes, but fake. The notion of authenticity became his company. And here we were. And then his cat joined us. And in these conversations that we had, Weiwei said, we can talk about everything, but we are being listened to. But let's not talk about money. So we talked candidly. And he told me later that when he left the studio, when the passport was given back, there was a kind of security, there was a raid, which he discovered later, where there was some spurious reason why some of the authorities came into the studio. And 2 years later, when he was rewiring the studio and replastering it, he found bugs hidden. So it was absolutely right. Tragically for me, though, when I went into the studio to meet him, thinking it was incredibly nefarious that I'd made this journey from London and I'd gone to the studio, within 3 minutes of me being in the studio, I got a text from a portrait painter, a friend of mine called Johnny Yeo, who said, "Hi Tim, since you're with Ai Weiwei, can you ask if he got my letter and would he possibly agree to sit for me?" And I said, "How the hell do you know I'm with Ai Weiwei?" And he said, "He's Instagrammed your every move." So here is a man who is as open as possible because he's saying to the authorities, "I know you're watching me and I'm feeding you information to tell you that I know you're watching me." Anyway, Weiwei came to, eventually we made this show from afar, visits to the studio, phone calls, architectural plans, but he got his passport back 4 weeks before the show was due to open. So he came back via Berlin to see his son, because his young son had got him out of China. And then he came over to London, and he made 2 tiny tweaks to the exhibition, which showed how much he'd been able to judge it just from plans and so on. But we had this amazing experience of installing 70 tons of rebar, which was straightened. But this was the rebar, this was the scaffolding from the schools that were all destroyed in the Sichuan earthquake of 2008. 5,335 school children died. Weiwei collected the names of all of them. That was the register. And we made this piece, but as we were finishing, there was a moment where he got this fantastic chandelier installation, bicycles, but with lights. And the instructions from his brilliant studio were miscommunicated. So my team, with his studio team, plugged this thing in, wired it up, switched it on, and we literally blew half of Piccadilly lights out the night before the exhibition. At which point, and Weiwei looked slightly bemused, and the head of installation said, "We'll sort it, boss." It was a joke. She was the boss, really. She said, "We'll sort it, but can you and I, Weiwei, go for supper, and we'll sort it, and you can come back, it'll be fine." So I walked out with him, and this was the courtyard, and these were the trees that he'd assembled from the dead fragments of trees that he'd collected, and he'd made this chair, which was in marble, black marble, and it's a copy of the chair that his father, who he revered, the great Chinese poet I Ching, that his father sat in. As we came out, Weiwei saw this couple. I think my parents would say they were courting. I think in the 1980s we said snogging. You probably say making out, but whatever. They were sitting on a chair there. And Weiwei took a photograph and put it on his Instagram and then moved closer to take another one. And he got me in the photograph, and then I saw this. And the guy was sort of like this. And then he looked, And that kind of British thing where someone's taking a photograph of you snogging on a chair, you look quite aggressive. And so I stepped in and said, "Oh, this is the artist." And the guy's face just completely melted. And he said, "I like your work." And Ai Weiwei said, "I like yours. Carry on." Postscript, in the context of art and design. And of course, a shameless plug for the fact that Ai Weiwei is doing a show at the Design Museum, the first big show ever through the lens of architecture and design, next April. And for him, activism, filmmaking, art, architecture, design, collecting, they're all part of the same impulse. And we were in the Design Museum 2 weeks ago, and he did a talk 2 days ago, but 2 weeks ago, and we were arranging photographs for him for a publicity campaign. And we walked past the beautiful Studio Myerscough, designer, maker, user. And we're calling the show Ai Weiwei Making Sense, or Ai Weiwei Making Sense. And so one of the team at the Design Museum said, "Well, perhaps you'd stand in front of the word maker." And he said, he laughed, and he went, "Why? Designers aren't makers." And I said, "Well, what are they?" He said, "They're fuckers." And I said, "Oh, and what are artists?" And he went, "They're fucked." So if you want to know the difference between art and design, according to Ai Weiwei, that's the point. But actually the real point for him is that he wants artists and designers, he thinks too many of them are not close enough to the notion or the process or the understanding of making. Anyway, that's my story, or my stories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. You are an amazing narrator, and I love the way you express this. So that was awesome, and the way you captivated the audience. I'm sure everybody loved it.
So 3 fucks.
And yeah, we'll bleep it while we're going to edit. But just a quick question, and then I'm going to let the audience and let the guest ask if they have any question. You collect stories from people, and you retell them sometimes to the same people. You know, it's like, "I like yours," and he says he like yours. You know, so these two approaches, collecting and retelling, how does that balances out?
I think it's a really interesting idea. It's a really good question. I mean, we live our story. We live, and then we get stories from living. But we hear other people's stories, and they become our stories. So the Ai Weiwei story I've just told you, you know, he photographed it, but I tell the story. And he didn't remember the details of it till I told it recently to him and reminded him. And then he remembered it. Then he was referring to, he told someone else of the same story, but from his perspective, having heard my perspective. And that's not to say that stories are inauthentic. But, you know, I've heard Gilbert and George tell many of the same stories over and over again, but there's always new ones as well. And there's always a consistency of how it is, but sometimes the details change. And I love the way that it's not just our fading memories as we get older. It's the fact that stories gain layers, don't they? They become richer. And it kind of, I mean, the stories I've told you are as I remember them. And I think, broadly speaking, the kind of punchlines and the gist of them are true. But they become embellished, and they become something more than the experience that one had. And that's what makes it so rich. And so I always try and stop myself when I interview a fiction writer. You know, the obvious question is, how much of your life is this based on? To which many writers say, well, I don't know, some or none. It doesn't matter. It's in my head, but it's my story, and I've lived it, in a sense, in the writing of it. And I think that's kind of interesting. So, the lovely thing about stories is, once they're out in the open, they're your stories as much as mine. So I don't own them anymore. You can tell those bad stories if you like to anyone. But but I think that's interesting. But collecting stories is the nice way of putting it.
Thank you. And you used the word living sculpture a few times. Some of you got a chance to sit on a living sculpture designed by loads of designers which Kartell commissioned. Some of you don't have, but we can later, next time when you're going to go up and grab a drink, you're going to experience some of those living sculptures. Anybody has any questions for Tim? We can take 2 questions, right? Something? Yeah. One, okay.
Would I like a drink? Working. Yes, thank you. That's a lovely fantastic. Marvelous. Next question. Whatever.
Hello, hello, hello.
Of what are you afraid? Of what are you afraid?
Nice question. Of what I am afraid? Two nights ago, with this talk with Ai Weiwei, a young man in the audience got the microphone and did a very stumbled preamble, and then said that Ai Weiwei was one of his heroes. And it turned out this man was from China, from Hunan province, that Ai Weiwei had been exiled to and was talking about. And then he said, I just admire you so much. And then he stopped, and I thought that was it, and he seemed to have a thing. And I said, don't mind us, or something, to make a joke. And then he gained his confidence, and then he said, were you afraid when you were in detention? Because I've had some experience of being detained. And anyway, Weiwei answered it by saying he wasn't. He said when he knew his son was, he wouldn't see his son for 13 years, which was a threat, or they were threatening these kind of things. He said it made him sad, but he wasn't afraid. I asked the young man then, I said, were you afraid? He said, yeah. And then I spoke to him later, and it was more the threat. He wasn't. The police came to see him. He'd gone back to Shanghai. It was locked down, and there was an interrogation at his house about where he'd come from and what he did. But there was that fear, and I realised I would have been afraid in that situation. But the thing I'm most afraid of was making a really insensitive remark in public. So saying to him when he was about to be sent, he was about to deliver something that I just thought, he doesn't really know what he wants to ask, saying something flippant. And yeah, the thing I fear most is just being clunky and inappropriate in public situations and trampling on people's vulnerabilities. I don't mean that in a sentimental way, but I think if you have a public position and you're publicly proclaiming, I think if you insensitively put people down or tread on them, as it were, I think that's something I'm slightly fearful of. So just being clunky and cack-handed. But I'm fearful of pain and death, I suppose, ultimately.
We just have one request from the panel, which I can't deny.
Can I ask you a question? So if artists are, what did you say, they were fucked, and designers were, yeah, designers are fuckers, what does it mean? Where are curators then? Oh.
Do you know, I mean, I could take this metaphor anyway. I could say they are the dildos of cultural life or whatever. But I think they're voyeurs. They're facilitators. They're date makers. They're matchmakers. Some of my curatorial friends will be horrified because they value their authorial skills. They value the expertise and the scholarship that they bring, and they bring a lot of that. And I've done a bit of that on occasion. But I think the best curators actually facilitate creative people to do the best they can, particularly when you're working with living artists. And when you work with historical artifacts, you still have a kind of responsibility for a creative as well as a cultural vision. But dildos, really, yeah.